when you've been with someone a long time, you get to read their body language and you almost know what they're going to say before they say it because you've still had that connection. And it feels like that with God. I don't need to say something to him. He doesn't need to say anything to me, but I know. I have this deeper sense of knowing than I ever had before. But it took a couple of years for me to get the point. And my whole life had to change for that to be outworked.
Getting exposed to a little bit on Melchizedek.
Yeah.
And I just have, a question. I think everybody's got a different opinion about this, but I thought I'd ask you, Mike. Um, as I think about him as having no birth, no death, no father, no mother, who do you think he is? Do you think of him as the pre-incarnate Christ, or do you think of him as another being? I'm just curious about that. And I also have another question to ask after that. So,
Sure. Yeah, my engaging with Melchizedek as a being is that he is a created angelic being. Um, no, angels are not all the same, obviously. I'm just talking about a created being that's not human. Um, and from the perspective of having no genealogy, really, that's not really talking about from an earthly perspective. It's trying to help us understand our identity within the order of Melchizedek as sons. So we also have no genealogy other than God, from that perspective. And I think, of the order of Jesus being a high priest of the order of Melchizedek. So what is that Melchizedek order? Well, I think it describes king and priest. So there's a royal priesthood that is the heavenly and earthly outworking type of position. So we are kings and priests, and I think Peter calls us a royal priesthood. So it's sort of tying together our function or our identity. Now, there are those who say Melchizedek was there in the beginning before God created others with wisdom, and that Melchizedek was involved in receiving Jesus's offering of himself before the foundation of the world. Now, I don't know whether that is true, but I've heard it said. And I don't sort of have any issue with potentially that being true. But the context of it is obviously Jesus didn't die as God before the foundation of the world, but he did present himself to the Father on behalf of mankind so that mankind were always predestined to be restored to a face-to-face relationship with God. And I think when you read about wisdom, wisdom is also indicates in Proverbs that was there in the beginning. Well,
Mhm.
what the beginning of what? Well, not the beginning
Yeah,
of God,
yeah.
but the beginning of God's thoughts about creation, perhaps, and then the outworking of those thoughts in the beginning of creation. And you could say that we were also included in God in his thoughts when creation began in God.
Mhm.
Um, so therefore, there are illustrations of us seeing creation from God's creative perspective. So I think all these things sort of are a little bit like, okay, it's unprovable, and no one can prove any of it. Um, and you could go and ask Melchizedek himself, okay, well, who are you? And what
Mhm.
he'll tell you is probably that which God wants him to relate to you and how it would relate to you. So, but I definitely don't believe it's anything to do with Jesus because Jesus is the high priest of the order of Melchizedek, and Melchizedek was a priest. Now, one of the other roles that Melchizedek seems to have within the 12 high chancellors' houses is of the treasury house, that he is the one who is the High Chancellor of the Treasury House, that is helping to release the resources that are available to us in the fulfillment of our destiny within the order of Melchizedek, which is priest, king, prophet, legislator or oracle legislator. So there are these functions in which we function out of that order. And those are some of the things I think that are around Melchizedek. Now, you can find vast teachings, things on Melchizedek, and you can find vast sort of quite esoteric stuff out there, and a lot of stuff which I would try and keep it simple. The focus isn't Melchizedek. The focus is us being of the order of Melchizedek and Jesus
Mm-hmm.
being the high priest of that order. So our
Mm-hmm.
focus is never going to be on Melchizedek, but on Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I
I
don't
see.
believe Melchizedek was a person,
Mm-hmm.
as in a human being. I
Mm-hmm.
believe he was a created being,
Yeah.
a function, within God's order, and it is representative of, and I think that's when it describes him in that way, it's not trying to make it difficult for us to understand. It's trying to actually see, here's something you can relate to when you see yourself as a son from that perspective of God, rather than trying to work it all out. Oh, what does that mean? Got no genealogy, therefore he was not born. Well, and I think that's confused the issue for a lot of people, because then they're trying to fit Jesus into the picture. Well, Jesus was born, and you say, well,
Yeah.
he had no genealogy. Well, of course he had a genealogy. He had a genealogy which was written in the Bible, but personally, I don't believe Jesus had either egg or sperm that came from Mary or from Joseph, or it was an implanted egg that came from God. He didn't carry the genetic record of man in that way. But he,
It's interesting there. It just thought popped into my head. It's Jesus had a human genealogy, so he had a point of birth on earth, but he was eternal. And
yes.
we are in him, he is in us.
Hmm.
So does that give us, I hate to say this, but almost this sense of being eternal too? Because
Oh,
at what
absolutely.
point
Yeah.
are we part of the Lord, or is there a point in which we become part of the Lord? Do you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
Because God
No,
is
I
eternal.
totally believe that
Yeah.
we are both immortal
Mm-hmm.
and have an eternal quality assigned to us as sons, which means we have eternal abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at all that, you sort of begin to expand the full understanding of who we are as sons of God. And we came out of eternity. Eternity is placed in our heart, it says in Ecclesiastes. And therefore, there's a sense where right in the core of our being is the connection between us and eternity and creation in time. So, you can say transcendent and immanent. Um, and God is transcendent, but he's also immanent. He lives in every moment with us. And we also have a transcendent nature in which we come out of God, and we were pre-existent before we came into this world. So our spiritual dynamic and our spiritual memory, which is being restored to us, is to bring us back to who we truly are from that eternal perspective. And therefore, we begin to see that we're designed and created to be multidimensional, transdimensional, non-linear, and unrestricted by time and space, which sort of expands our capacity as sons of God to live in multiple places at multiple times, doing multiple things in
Mm-hmm.
the spirit, and still
Mm-hmm.
enjoy life on earth, because it's life connected to the physical creation that gives us the outworking of our sonship,
Mm-hmm.
in that God created us to connect with creation and to steward creation. And now our freedom will bring creation's freedom, and creation is longing and waiting for the revealing of our sonship. Now, what sonship? The eternal nature of it. That's why
Mm-hmm.
creation has not responded to us in a positive way, because we've lost the eternal identity that we should have. So I do believe that there is a restoration of our true identity, and it brings that eternal perspective to it, and the immortal perspective to it, in that God did not create us to die.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are restored to relationship with the life, Jesus being the way, the truth, the life, then we're restored to his original intention for us, which is not to die. And Jesus said, in John 6, whoever eats, this bread that comes down to heaven won't die. And he was talking about physical death, now we've lost sight of all that. And I believe God is bringing us back into the full recognition of who we are as sons, and therefore our eternal and immortal nature, which is always been God's intention. And restoration is restoring us back to his original intention for us, rather than that which we have adopted through our own personal experiences or adopted through our religious teaching, other things which have sort of lessened that. And, people translate the Bible wrongly. It's like, well, we're made lower than the angels. No, we're not. Actually, the word there for angel is actually the word for God. And we're made a little lower than God, effectively, not a little lower than angels. And therefore we're clothed with glory and majesty and honor, which is our true identity. And when we know who we are, I think in Romans, where it says, that creation will be set free from its bondage to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. That is our true identity. That glory represents who we really are in God as sons. And I think that's something that God is beginning to restore us to.
That's good. Yeah, lots to process there. I also have one other question. And I'm not sure how to articulate this exactly, Mike, but what kind of practices or protocols would you suggest for those who want a much deeper dive in this topic? Maybe of some books or, just anything that, you would have to offer there.
In terms of Melchizedek, I think there is so much material out there from so many different perspectives.
Yeah.
It's not easy to try and draw from it, because you'll get confused. There was some material that I started looking at many years ago, and I started to get confused because it was so complicated and layered of this and that and the other. So I thought, went back to the drawing board and said, okay, God, what is it that you want me to know that relates to me? And I think that's the key. Excuse me. And then you can then see how the relationship with God is the key that will under sort of gird who we are, and then bring about how we relate to Melchizedek or that order. And I think that's the key. There's vast sums of information about Melchizedek and all sorts of esoteric things, which I don't think has any real relevance to everyday life. So for me, I'd rather stick with, what do you want me to know, God? And how can I relate to Melchizedek in regards to who he is as the High Chancellor of the Treasure Room of Heaven, and how that relates to how I can be resourced in outworking who I am, because there's provision for me to be me. Now, some people talked about this whole thing of, well, you've got to keep trading with Melchizedek. That was one fad that was going around, I don't know, a few years ago. Well, everything you do, you've got to go and trade it back on the trading floor of heaven. And there was lots of stuff about the trading floors of heaven that, you receive something, trade it back for more. And it's like, again, it just made it so complicated. It's like, oh, everything you get, I've got to go and give that back as a trade or an offering. Or, and actually, I went to God with this and said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, well, nothing. It's like, You
That
didn't
does
need to
sound a
do
bit
any of that.
legalistic.
Well, yeah, and that's
Yeah.
part of the problem. Things become legalistic when people start to, you've got to do this. And I said, well, I've never done that, God. Am I doing it wrong? He says, well, what do you think? Basically, no, you're not doing it wrong. You know, there's nothing wrong. And occasionally I would go before the throne of God and like cast my crowns before his feet and just say, oh, I want to give you everything. And I, in thanksgiving and gratitude and everything. And occasionally I would do that. But I didn't have to go and do that every time I had a revelation or every time something happened. Otherwise, I would just be doing that all the time. And, so I just stay away from things that make it more complicated than it needs to be.
Mhm.
And if you resonate with something, great. And if you don't, just leave it. And that's what I found. I didn't resonate with a lot of stuff that seemed to be becoming more and more complicated and protocol driven.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
I found I have a relationship with God. There's no protocol to that. And I found, in a lot of what I was hearing, it became seemingly more and more protocol driven and more legalistic. And well, you've got to say Yod Hey Vav Hey 70 times and that'll open a door into heaven. It's like, well, I've never said it 70 times. I've just stepped into an open door, you know. And now I realize that I'm connected internally into that realm through soul and spirit being connected. So I've always found whenever people started to get legalistic or protocol driven, I found it was less
Mhm.
and less like my relationship with God, which is purely he's my dad and I enjoy his presence and he enjoys mine.
Mhm.
And all of the agendas that seemingly came with the protocols, you know, just got, removed. I just didn't relate to them at all. It just seemed in my relationship with God is very simple. It's
Mhm.
based in love, unconditional love. And it just seemed that there more and more conditions were put on things. If you didn't do it right, if you didn't do it this way, if you didn't do it the way we do it, or any of that type of thing. So I just shied away from all that and just basically focused on intimacy,
Mhm.
relationship, and that God unveiled through that relationship what I needed to know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And if I didn't need
Yeah.
to know it, then I don't need to know it. That's thing. And I need to know less. The more I've gone on, actually, the more I know God's love is unconditional, and therefore, there is no duty or obligation to it. There's just a desire for intimacy and relationship.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that, God didn't teach me through the order of Melchizedek in my function as a priest and a king and an oracle and a legislator. In my sonship, I learned a lot and I began to realize what that meant, how I could be the voice of God, how I had the authority of being seated in heavenly places, how as a priest I had access into the very heart of God and back into the eternal nature of God, in the perichoresis of God. I learned so much and
Mhm.
experienced so much through it, but it was relational and not purely protocol driven. And I know
Mhm.
people are caught up into, well, I've got to be the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the man, and I've got to be that, and I've got to outwork it, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do that. And I found, to be honest, the more I knew God, the less I had to do,
Mhm.
you know, um, in that way, really.
Yeah, that really makes sense. Let me just ask you one more question on this. When you did your research, was a lot of that sourced in Jewish writings that you were reading, or was it in Christian writings, or maybe
Uh,
both?
a sort of mixture.
Hmm.
There were a few people who were sort of part of this mystic community
Hmm.
who wrote extensively on it.
Hmm.
Um, and I was interested in the beginning, and then it just became so complicated and so layered that it was just, oh, this is going to be so hard work to get any understanding of this or a practical working on it. So I just didn't feel connected to it, so I just left it. Now, some people, they love that stuff, and that's fine if they feel that's good for them, great, and I'm not knocking that. It may have some application to their lives. It just didn't. relate to mine
Mhm.
um, in that way. And I think, there's horses for courses, I guess. Some people get stuff out of some things and don't get out of others. And for me, that, because I was interested, because I was looking at, well, what is the order of Melchizedek? And I was doing teaching on it. And so I was sort of drawn to look at some things. And I thought, but as soon as I started delving into it, it just was almost so esoteric. It didn't have an application to my life. It was interesting, and I could have, out of interest or out of intellectual curiosity, pursued reading more and more and more about it. But I felt God sort of kept me from that because, you know, I have a tendency to be like that. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to all sorts of stuff. I like sort of delving into things and finding out about things, and help and understanding them. But God sort of kept me from that. And one of the things I remember, I was going into the library room of heaven, and I got a glimpse of this amazing place, and then the lights went out and all I could see was one book,
Hmm.
you know, and it was like, how frustrating to be in a book where like a place in heaven where there's all the knowledge of heaven, and I'm only allowed to look at one book, you know. But God kept me from myself because I could have gone into that place and never ever come out if I just followed my own thing. Because it'd be like, wow, look at this, wow, look at that, look at that, look at that, and it would have been a pursuit of knowledge, and I would have known a lot. But actually, I didn't need to know that. I only needed to know what I needed to know. So God gave me one thing to see. It was a very simple thing. It was a book about me. So it was like, so you have a book about my life. You could say it's my destiny. That wasn't prescriptive. And that's what I think. So I wanted to read it and find out everything. But it didn't have information like that. It was more a revelation of who I am, who God created me to be, rather than a whole list of things I'm going to do in my life. Which is what also happens when people want to know their scroll of destiny and they want to know what they're going to do and all of the amazing things and all this. Well, I don't believe that our scroll of destiny says anything about what we're going to do. It says who we are. And if we discover who we are, we will outwork who we are within the context of God's heart and God's kingdom without ever having to know a whole list of things that are things that we're designed to do in our lives. It says somewhere, I think it's Proverbs somewhere, that, your gift makes room for you. And I think that's true. If you just are who you are created to be, it will create room for you to be able to express that creatively as a son of God. And I think the problem is people want almost a prescriptive list of things that they can tick off. And I think there's a sense of works in that rather than relationship in that. So what I discovered, my destiny is a revelation of who I am as a son of God, made in the image and likeness of God, and reveals me in my state of being, not doing. And when I first heard about a scroll of destiny, I was desperate to see it and read it. And God showed me something, and on the outside of it, there was something which related to where I was at that time, but He never allowed me to read, the whole, what I thought might have been in it. So I just continued to pursue the relationship that would unveil my true identity, and then that freed me from
Mhm.
any need to perform or to prove it by what I was doing. So I started in doing, and I've ended up in being. So I started pursuing something, but God didn't let me go into the intellectual knowledge of it. He always wanted it to bring me into, this is who you are.
Mhm.
You relate to these things because this is who you are. you know,
Hmm.
and he has wired me in a particular way. But I've learned that that doesn't give me my identity. That is an outworking of who I am. It doesn't create who I am. And that's, you know, something which I've learned to embrace over the years, which I think has brought me to a place where I'm at rest in the understanding of my essentially, you know, multi-dimensional, trans-dimensional nature, and therefore, you know, I can be doing multiple things at multiple times and not need to know any of them until I do, and then I will, you know. And so I enjoy life in this realm beyond what I would have thought possible, and I feel God's presence and feel his pleasure in everyday life with me more so than any spiritual activity I would have done in the past in church or ministry or anything else. Purely walking in the garden, or it's a such overwhelming joy which has gone beyond any of what I would have done before, because God is bringing it back to this very simple basic relationship. And he had to wean me off my sort of lifestyle of engaging with him.
Hmm.
I would engage with him every day. First thing I would do in the morning, get up, spend a few hours with him, journal, having, you know, wonderful time with him and everything. And it was awesome. And I never thought it would stop, you know. And then God said to me one day, I don't want you to do this anymore. Now, I thought he was saying, you don't need to teach this anymore. So you don't need to do a Vision Destiny series every year. You don't need to record this for other people. But I carried on doing it because I didn't think he would not want me to do that. And then one day it was like, why are you still doing this? I'm like, well, don't you want me to do this? He says, didn't I ask you to stop? I'm like, oh, I thought you meant stop teaching it. No, you don't need to journal like this anymore. Now, that was a struggle. You know, it
Hmm.
was a struggle to let go of that because I really enjoyed it. And I think I was getting something from it, which I think probably wasn't pure. And then eventually, you know, then when I stopped journaling, I still carried on engaging with God. I just didn't journal it. And then it was like, it was almost like, oh, do you not get it? No, I don't want you to do this anymore. So I'm like, well, that's just really hard to let go of what has been my life. You know, in just the last 10 years, I mean, I always spent time with God. You know, I was disciplined. I'd get up early. I want to spend that time, whether it's reading the Bible or praying or whatever I used to do. Now it was engaging, you know, in conversation or experiences with God. And then eventually it was like, no. And I said, well, why? You know, why? Why don't you want me to spend this intimacy with you? Because he wanted me to engage in a new way of relating, a new type of relationship, which is more intimate in everyday life, in which I started to feel God's pleasure with me wherever I was and whatever I was doing. And it wasn't based on any form of performance of any religious stuff. So I'm like, okay. So I'm feeling the pleasure of God when I'm in the garden, or when I'm out for a walk in the countryside, or whether I'm in my workshop, or even when I'm sitting watching a movie and we're sitting on the sofa just having a laugh. I know God is there and his pleasure is intense. And that's what he was trying to say. If you keep doing this, you're not going to fully realize what this relationship's about, because you're relating it to an act rather than a lifestyle of always having this sense of my presence and intimacy and relationship. And now, you know, it's like you know, when you've been with someone a long time, you get to read their body language and you almost know what they're going to say before they say it, because you've still had that connection. And it feels like that with God. I don't need to say something to him. He doesn't need to say anything to me, but I know. I have this deeper sense of knowing than I ever had before, but it took a couple of years for me to get the point. And my whole life had to change for that to be outworked. It was almost like, okay, I didn't quite see the significance of this shift that God had promised in my life. Back in 2017, God said, you have 3 years to prepare for a shift that's coming. Now, okay, great. And occasionally I said, well, what am I supposed to do to prepare for it? And it was like, no, if you know what it is, then that will be a problem to you. So just, it's almost like, well, I can't prepare for something I don't know. And then God asked me to do some things. I remember he said, I've got a new quest for you. I said, what is it? Well, you'll only know after you've done it. I'm like, oh, well, that's really, unfair. He said, how can I say yes to something I don't know? Well, do you trust me? Well, yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah, then. And then I realized why he didn't tell me, because I would have so struggled even the thought of doing what I was going to do. And the same thing, in terms of the shift, he didn't tell me what the shift was. He didn't tell me what it related to. And then when looking back, I now realize it related to so much. Personal shift, ministry shift, world shift, everything. He didn't tell me that, there was a pandemic coming that was going to change how the world operated for a while. But that was when the shift took place, and it was a world shift, and there were things that happened in that shift, and that shifted me in my being able to engage people, because I was no longer doing what I was doing before in some ways. I wasn't traveling. Therefore, I was able to engage, and that sort of took a different perspective on things, that I was doing things corporately with some other people, which I never did before. Most of what I was doing was on my own, in terms of engaging with God or legislating. And then I'm suddenly got the ability to engage with a whole load of people like Justin and Nancy and Lindy and others. And it was like, wow, this is different. And therefore, I learned to play with others, whereas I didn't need to learn to play with others when I did everything myself. And that was good. It taught me some things, and I learned some things, and it then opened the door to, hey, we can all do this type of thing together. And I found that I went deeper into certain things when we had these encounters. But for me, I didn't just stay with that encounter. I went deeper and deeper and deeper into all those encounters, because that's the nature of who I am. And it was springboarded from this shift. So the fact that I wasn't traveling because of COVID opened up a door for a shift to take place in how I functioned. And eventually that opened up a door for a completely change of life, and letting go of all the ministry stuff I was doing and all of the responsibilities I had that I let go of, because God was saying, no, I want you to enter into a whole different phase of life in which I want you to know me in a completely different context, to know me, and now I realized, what God was doing to bring me to where I am now. Now, would I have ever agreed to go through that process and all of the hardships that was and all of the emotional turmoil that was, if he told me this is what you got to go through? I'd be like, I'm not sure I want to go through that. Or do I really have to go through that? It's like, take this cut from me. I know that's what I would have felt like, because
Mhm.
now I look back and see, I rejoice and celebrate in what God being able to navigate me through that whole process. But it's something that's taken place that I couldn't have envisaged. And it's again one of these beyond type of things. God is able to do exceedingly beyond abundantly beyond what you can imagine or think. So when God said a shift, I could only imagine or think up to a level of what that shift could be, or changes that could take place. Now I look back and think that is so beyond what I would have even been able to imagine or think at that point. And the beyonds, keep coming, because with God, there's always a beyond. But now I'm not pursuing those beyonds
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of engaging the beyonds. All I'm doing is enjoying every day with God and enjoying the joy. Joy for me has gone to a completely different level. Now, it doesn't mean, I go along, walk around with the sort of bliss type, external type of thing, but I have an inner joy and inner peace and experience inner love way, way beyond anything that I would have known about, because God is just so much more than everything,
You found the secret sauce. You
Well,
really did, Mike. I mean, that's the heart
yeah.
of really what I think the mystic movement is about, and what probably I would think all or most of us are trying to get at that place of really deep,
Oh,
deep, deep intimacy and communion with God. I mean, that's the really powerful draw, I think, of this whole movement
yeah.
is the love of God and the love that people in the mystic movement. I've never been in a group of Christians who have manifested so much love as I've
Yeah.
seen, over the years where I've connected, with you, with other people, Justin, Nancy, the list goes on. But there's something, I hate to say it, but almost qualitatively different, which I think is that deep inner connection with God that it really is the love of God that is being
Mm.
birthed within everybody's spirit and mind and soul. And, and we all have so much to learn in that process. Sometimes we wobble one direction or wobble another direction, but
Yeah.
hopefully God has us on track so we will stop wobbling, eventually.
Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
think the key really is not to try and determine where you're going or try and find a map for it, but just keep following.
yeah.
That for me is the key. I wouldn't have known where I was going. I wasn't capable of knowing where I was going. And even if God had tried to tell me, I think it would have been really difficult for me to embrace that. And everyone's on a different journey, all towards what God intends each person to have and be and everything else. So there are no two journeys that are the same. And therefore, you just can't look at it and say, oh, yeah, that's what I want. So, what I'm doing at the moment, I'm not saying that's for anybody else
Hmm.
because I don't know. Only God knows that. But what I know it's for me, and I'm totally at peace and rest in it. And I don't think I've ever been in such a place where there is no striving for anything. I just enjoy, and I find enjoyment and love in it all. Now, I'm not saying for others they may have a lot of things. Now, my journey was a lot of activity and a lot of outworking things until God brought an end to that. And I would not say to someone, well, stop doing everything you're doing, because what you're doing may be the steps to where you're going,
Hmm.
and everyone's going to be different in it. So, I couldn't quantify it and say this is what everyone should be looking for. All I could say is if you continue to go deeper in relationship with God, you will find yourself in a state of being which will be very different from where we are now, you know. Um, which is, it's not, I can't tell people how to get there.
Hmm.
I can't teach people how to get there. Because if I did, then it would become a protocol of how to get there rather than a relationship that leads you there. And I think that's the importance of it is the
Hmm.
relationship which leads us into a place where we become who we've always were intended to be. And we discover that at a level which is so much deeper than you could get any other way. And so I'm not criticizing those who are still doing all sorts of stuff. and some people, doing lots of things. I'm not knocking that. It's just not for me any longer,
Mhm.
and that's, for me, what God has basically brought me to, and when God wants me to engage in something, he's quite capable of giving me that direction. So, I hadn't done a conference live since 2020 when I was in Colorado Springs. That was the last time I did a conference. And then when I was talking with Justin and you're doing something about immortality, it was like, okay, do you want me to do this? And I was quite reticent to do it because I hadn't done it for 4 years or so. And then I felt the yes. And so when I did it, it was a joyful experience because I hadn't been in a live audience for
Mhm.
4.5 years. So it was very energizing, and I'd quite forgotten how little I can do when I'm in that energized state, in a sense. Because I've got 90 slides to do today, and you end up doing 30 because you get connected to people. And I loved that and I really enjoyed it. Would I want to go back doing that all the time? No. And I don't think God wants me to do it all the time. But on the occasion where he does, I'm not going to say no. And I will find the joy in it. And I like connecting with people. So, when I was in that setting, I just hung around and chatted and talked with people for hours, you know, and they was like, "Oh, it's time you need to go and get some food." So they come and rescue me from, Q&A sessions and talking with people because, well, that's what I'm there for. If I'm not there to connect with people, well, I could just do it from my room and do it by Zoom. But why God wanted me to be there was to connect with people in a physical way. And I really enjoyed that. So I just give myself over to that in that setting. So things change, but as long as you're keeping following and engaging the heart of God, God will lead and direct and open up whatever avenues he has for that. God is good, life is good, um, and I'm enjoying it and full with joy for it all. It's joyful.
That's awesome, Mike.
Okay.
So, Mike and everybody,
Yeah.
hi, I'm glad to be with everybody. I pretty much have advocated being with you quite a bit, so I'm glad to be with you. I happen to run into Robin, if she cares to say where, and she can reveal that, but we just have nowhere ran into each other in the same space at the same time. And so that was good. And the Lord has blessed me. I hopefully am on the path to actualizing immortality because I'm going in the right direction, seemingly. Uh, my doctor had diagnosed me 2 years or so ago with diabetes 2, and it got worse and worse. And then the last time I'd seen her, I think like last July or something, she said, "Okay, next time I see you, it looks like I'm going to put you on insulin." And I don't want to hear that. And it became the motivation I needed. I have lost, let's see, I started at about 208, 209. I was on the scale this morning. It was around close to 170. And so I've lost very substantial weight, and I plan to keep losing. My sugar level, if you're familiar at all, was up, I think, above 9, which is not good at all. It's gone down the last time they checked it to 5.7, which is phenomenal, which is well in the normal range. My BP has gone to great as well, no issue there. And so it kind of goes on. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Feel better and just very, very grateful. So, Mike, I was going to give you my own perspective of your evolution since I've been kind of seeing you from afar off, not in person as such, but you so well addressed it, I think. Here today, I will not do that. I will say I think my own journey is quite similar. you've heard me say at times when I've been on with you guys that God would just take me and kind of hold me, cuddle me with Him in intimacy and love and phenomenally within experiencing His presence. But, I came, I guess it was around 2015, something like that, through a guy by the name of Mike Parsons into the heavenlies, and back then I began to have one phenomenal supernatural encounter after another, and for years, many, many encounters. And but again, in my own evolution, it's kind of been more based towards Mike. Maybe I just am not hearing God because I haven't heard Him. Maybe I don't want to hear Him tell me yet to cut off my lifestyle, which is very similar to what he was talking about. I'm normally up hours for years, spending time with God in various ways. But what I'm really encountering and experiencing is, and God knows I don't mean to project myself as to more than who I am, because I, so many ways, have a long ways to go. But having said that, I'm there. I'm in heavenly places, multi-located. I'm in ministry phenomenally in means that I don't have to cognitively be involved, whether it's dimensionally, whether it's from heavenly places of operation where I'm seated. And I don't have to go anywhere. I sense the angelic, the cloud of witnesses. All I have to do is focus. And the reality of the presence of the Lord. I have the old Pentecostal background. So if I let myself, I'll go into a shout and Pentecostal type. So I still do that. But I mean, I don't have to tarry at an altar or go on my knees and pray and beg God, let your presence come. I'm in His presence all the time. And so the more aware of that I've become, the more engaging that in personal, intimate relationship, cognitively, the more real that the beauty of the Lord and actualizing Him and knowing Him. And I'm just very, very grateful to God for His goodness therein. I spend a lot of time, again, I look at it as ministry, whether I'm watching Mike, watching Justin, and Robin, back to Melchizedek. Justin put on Patreon his most recent trip to South Africa. I think there's 9 particular sessions that he's made available. So Nancy Cohen gets into quite a bit about Melchizedek in one of her ministry presentations. And I think it blessed me in various ways. She does talk about Melchizedek before the foundation of the world, essentially as the high priest that took care of the sacrifice of Jesus, and some other things that she was sharing. But I think there were some good things that she did say. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I've been stuck in various ways. I opted to go to GAN, engaging myself as a participant. Mike knows well about GAN. If you don't, it's the Grace and Awakening Network with Don Keithley, phenomenal, I think, medium of God sharing through many, many venues and people. Greater truth than most people have been exposed to. And I went ahead and got a slot. They have expanded what they're doing. Originally, they were just on Roku television, but I mean, that alone had, I forget, 70 million potentially viewers, I guess, whatever the case is. But I have been very, very unfaithful. I'm supposed to weekly be sending a video where it goes on every week. I have an hour slot, have done very little of that. And of course, it's concerned me. And I'm sure a lot of that is on me. I'm not going to put it on God. But back to relating to what Mike was saying, I think God is very well capable of saying, Dan, I want you immediately to get going. I'm saying this to you. Thus saith the Lord. Get your week. I don't sense that. So I have to really see God for whether I should even continue to, because I'm paying a lot of money to do nothing in a sense, to be in that position and see just as that leads. So anyhow, that's kind of an update on where I'm at and on things. I'm grateful for all of you, and especially Mike, because I watch you. I'm with you all the time. Normally every day I keep up with you pretty well. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Dan. It's great. Yeah, Grace Awakening Network's great. Again, I sort of was invited to be part of it, but I didn't feel that's what God wanted me to do. But I promote it all the time because I believe it's the one of the fulfillments that I saw many years ago of different streams coming together and flowing in sort of this river of restoration. And so it's great to see people from different backgrounds all beginning to connect with this message. So I'm very encouraged by that, and I feel it's definitely what I saw, and now to see it sort of starting to begin to blossom, for me, it's great, and I support it and promote it all the time, you know, but I never felt to participate in it, just because that's not where I am at the moment with God, but certainly encourage other people to listen to it and engage because there's just so much there which is showing what God is doing in our days, bringing people from all sorts of disparate backgrounds flowing together into this message, which is beginning to awaken people in the world, and the exposure of that message of unconditional love and the finished work of Jesus and God's grace and all of that amazing subjects, for me is really, really good. And I highly recommend it. And I feel it is what God is doing. This is not someone's good idea. This is definitely an outworking and a fulfillment of God's heart to awaken the world to a different message of love. I'm sure he'll use many other ways of doing it, but this is certainly one of them. So yeah, definitely an encouraging sign of God at work in the world. Because there's a lot of other stuff which we look around and think, "God, this is not so good." But that doesn't mean God is not going to bring good out of all of that. And if we, as sons, legislate in it all, we can, ensure that God's purposes are continue to be fulfilled, even if it doesn't look like it on the surface. But I do believe God's,
So Mike,
is at work.
what I've observed with GAN,
Mm.
and this is not, it is a concern, but like you're saying, I see it as an absolute move of God bringing streams together. And I think when you're moving in that kind of a flow, you're going to continue to progress.
Mm.
What I haven't seen is the kind of progression that I would like to see, because I think the concern is that, we can, just like any other movement, if you want to go back before the 1900s, we'll start there. Azusa Street,
Mm.
I think, 06, and then you get the Charismatic in the 1960s, and others like the Kingdom, and now the Mystical. They generally tend to, every one of them, become stuck in the truth that they
Mm.
have. And so a concern is with GAN, and their, I think, greatest emphasis is the inclusion message, which of
Mm.
course is a step way, way beyond where most people that profess to be born again, unfortunately, are. Most people have not gone there, and they're going to look at that, with
Mm.
various labels, etc. Although we can see people advancing still because of the move of God. But
Mm.
I do have a concern, and I posted because I'm with these groups online, like through Facebook or whatever, and I communicate. Yes, it's great where you're at, and it's beautiful, but that there is more. And I
Yeah.
mean, I've encouraged anyone on all of them to continue to move forward.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, when I originally saw four streams coming together, you know, and beginning to come into one, what I would see now is they're not yet one. There's still the four streams. And so within GAN, there are those who have their own particular way of looking at it. So some will be looking at the eschatology side of it. Some will be looking at the inclusion side of it, which is the general message of it, but they have an emphasis. And that's okay. But they need to come together into actually, there's an overall thing that God is doing, which is beyond where you are right now. but I'm still encouraged that that is taking place, and that people are from those different streams are still interacting, and seemingly without falling out over things that they don't agree with, because the main emphasis is this is something we can agree with. And you've got, you know, some of the people I think are further probably in their journey than they're actually publicly talking about, because that might be a step at the moment which is too far for where they are, and I'm okay with that, you know. So, you know, for me, when I look back and think, well, where did I come in all this? God had a particular order into it. He started with eschatology for me, and then led me, you know, into the mystic, and then led me into the inclusion, and alongside that sort of, you know, the sort of the energy healing type sort of outworking of all that, and the frequency and everything like that. So, you know, so you might do it the opposite way for other people. They may come in this way, but then they get drawn to the inevitable conclusion, you know, of the restoration of all things and what that fully means, you know, because that's ultimately where this river is going. But someone may come in on a tributary of that river, which for a while they still flow with. But eventually, I believe God will open people's eyes to see more of it, because a lot of people with the inclusion side aren't really functioning in the sonship, mystic, heavenly stuff as yet. And there are a lot of people, you know, in different streams of it, that's still their main emphasis, which is fine, because at the moment that's what's drawing them into this stream. But eventually I think God will unveil more of their true identity in sonship in it all, but in his time, you know. That's why probably, you know, I didn't get involved in actually participating in it, because actually my focus in that may have been a distraction actually to some of it, some of where sometimes people have to take the time to get where it's going, and God needs to set that time. And I didn't want to come in, you know, at a level of where people would struggle with some of the stuff I'm now talking about, you know. So I felt, no, I'm really comfortable. God's got this in hand. This is something which is moving forward, and God will bring people into the fullness of that. Sometimes kicking and screaming, of letting go of certain things, and other times embracing it as the most common sense thing there is. It's like, why didn't I see this before? You know, which is a little bit like I was like, it was like going along and all of a sudden, oh, I never saw that whole aspect of this and how that relates to everything. And then like, whoa, you know. And I think God's at work. He knows what he's up to. And I think it will eventually take people into into sonship, you know, if people keep going along with the river. That's where it's heading, you know. But yeah, it's good, and I'm encouraged, and I'm not, you know, I've become less needing instant change. I realize how long it took me to change, and I realize that means for a lot of other people it's also going to be a process that takes time. But this seems to be an inclusive group that is tolerant of the differences while remaining the similarities, which I think is good. And I think hopefully that will encourage more and more people to sort of, you know, eventually draw into that. If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.